Hi guys, I had a request to talk to you about PTSD, so I thought I would check in with y'all and we would just cover that today. We're going to go over diagnostic criteria and we're going to go over what are some things that you can do to help if you've got a diagnosis of PTSD. So let's jump right into it. The first thing that we want to talk about is let's go with the textbook definition. Okay, and I'm just going to read it right out of the manual that I've got over here. So there's several criteria that have to be met. Criterion A, the person was exposed to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence in the following ways: direct exposure, witnessing trauma, learning that a relative or close friend was exposed to trauma, or through indirect exposure to aversive details of the trauma, usually in the course of professional duties. So first responders, medics, counselors, you hear a story about something, or you witness somebody in the aftermath of a wreck, basically is what that's saying. Criterion B, intrusive symptoms. At least one of these is required. Unwanted, upsetting memories, nightmares, flashbacks, emotional distress after exposure to traumatic reminders, physical reactivity. So you have a physical response when you're exposed to traumatic reminders. And we'll get into that in a little more detail. Also, you can bounce back to my one on what is trauma to really kind of get a better picture of this too. Physical reactivity after exposure to traumatic reminders. Criterion C, avoidance. So avoidance of trauma-related stimuli, one of those is required in the following ways. So trauma-related thoughts or feelings, or trauma-related external reminders. Criterion D, negative alterations in cognitions and mood. Two of these are required. Negative thoughts or feelings that began or worsened after the trauma in the following ways: inability to recall key features of the trauma. So that would be kind of a dissociative response. Overly negative thoughts and assumptions about oneself or the world after a trauma has occurred. Exaggerated blame of self or others for causing the trauma. A negative affect. Decreased interest in activities, feeling isolated, difficulty experiencing positive affect. Criterion E, trauma-related arousal and reactivity that began or worsened after the trauma in the following ways: irritability or aggression, risky or destructive behavior, hypervigilance, heightened startle reaction, difficulty concentrating or difficulty sleeping. Criterion F, symptoms last for more than 1 month. Criterion G, symptoms create distress or functional impairment. Social or occupational phobias, for example, could get developed out of something like this. And exclusion, these symptoms are not due to medication, substance use, or other illness. So there are a couple of specifiers in this too. There's the dissociative specification, which basically means the person doesn't remember part of the trauma. Some of the triggers are from a result of the trauma because they don't remember the trigger or the sensory cue. And then delayed specification, derealization. Derealization is the experience of unreality. So like, is this real? Is my life real? Is any of this real? You'll get a lot of that. Things just don't seem real. And then delayed specification, full diagnostic criteria are not met until at least 6 months after the trauma, although the onset of the symptoms may occur immediately. So it's saying that there's a big long chunk of time in there before the symptoms start coming up. So for example, a person could start having a panic attack or reactivity 6 months later, and they were pretty okay or seemed fairly okay up until that point. That actually happens quite a bit. I think a lot of times people are just numb and it just takes time. When they start to thaw out, their brain kind of freezes up, and when it starts to thaw out over that 6 month period, that's when the trauma really shows itself. because they were just numb for 6 months. So a couple of things that I notice here in my office that kind of indicate me to start paying attention and to dig deeper diagnostically. Changes in impulse control, so a person becomes more impulsive. They start drinking more or using drugs that they never used before. Pain pill addictions, smoking more marijuana or smoking marijuana and they never did before. Anything to kind of activate the parasympathetic nervous system or calm themselves down. So you'll see people go to depressants a lot. A big shift in how a person is behaving, like they're snappy or angry or aggressive a lot more than normal. Sometimes it can be as simple as crowds. Take a person who all of a sudden doesn't want to go into the grocery store or doesn't want to drive their car, but they've always drove and they've been fine driving and they've been fine going to the grocery store. Those would be other things that I look for that don't necessarily mean a person's got PTSD, but it may be an indicator that they've got a trauma that they're working through on some level. Another question that I get quite a bit when it comes to PTSD is, how come some people have PTSD and some people don't? For example, 100 guys could go into battle, they're all in the same battle, and 25 come back with PTSD and the other 75 don't. I think some of it depends on the person's ability to recall memory and how they remember and learn things. People with a visual memory seem to get a few more cues. I don't know what that's all about, and it's just a theory on my part. But also people who come from a trauma background. So for example, if they come from a home where there was violence or sexual abuse or domestic violence or physical abuse as a child, those things absolutely are going to play into who gets trauma in life. But I'll also say this, I think everybody's got a cup, and once that cup is full, it's full, and then that's when it goes into a post-traumatic type stress. For example, military guys, they can get sent into battle 2-3 times, and then the 4th time, no different than the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd time, it's just like their cup gets full, like their brain is too full. It's got too many sensory details in there, too many loose associations. So if I write a diagnosis in here, that's the criteria that I use to write the diagnosis. In this day and age, it's kind of interesting. If you look at the history of post-traumatic stress disorder, back in the day, it was called shell shock, and it was really pretty narrow and specific to people who had been in combat and combat trauma. And what we've found out since then, as we've grown to understand trauma, is that it can come from physical abuse, sexual abuse, any number of things, car crashes, being raped. Hearing of these things, like if it happened to a family member, or seeing this happen to a family member, can also activate all of these things. Anytime that there's a wreck or an accident or a shock or surprise to the system, the sympathetic nervous system engages. That is your fight, flight, or freeze response. So when that activates, the brain takes sensory cues from around it and pulls those things in and says, oh, these are now dangerous, so we need to watch out for these things. So in a nutshell, post-traumatic stress just means that a person has had a real life situation that they perceived as a threat to their existence or a threat to their family's existence or a close friend's existence. And now, through loose association, it is activating the sympathetic nervous system. So that's really important for you to understand. Loose associations that are associated with that original incident are now a reminder that triggers and cues the brain to activate the fight or flight response. Now that we understand that, now the next segment, let's get into what you can do to fix this problem. Number one for me as a therapist who deals with trauma has to be EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And so the most important thing that you can do in my mind is seek out a professional who works specifically with eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Find somebody who's experienced in your area, who really specializes in trauma and does EMDR work. That's the person that you want on this. EMDR lets you go back into your head and basically take all those associations out so your brain stops triggering into the fight or flight response based off these loose sensory cues. It does that by reprocessing the event with either eye movements or bilateral stimulation, which is just like a tap or a buzz from right to left in your, usually people hold these little tappers in their hands that just vibrate from right to left. It sends an electrical message to your brain, lets your frontal lobes have a conversation with your primitive mind, and basically by the end of it, if it's a successful session, you take all those sensory cues out, you desensitize yourself to the event that occurred. Step 2, so really important here, when you are in a fight or flight state, so when your brain activates into a fight or flight state, sympathetic nervous system arousal. Your sympathetic nervous system is fully engaged when the fight or flight response is going. So what you've got to get good at is parasympathetic arousal. Parasympathetic nervous system is the relaxing. So sympathetic nervous system, tensing. Parasympathetic nervous system, relaxing. So think about taking a nice warm bath and just allowing your body to relax, or a nice warm shower. You smell the soap, you feel the warmth on your body. Think about how that relaxes the body, or a massage, or just laying in bed for some people, you know, where your body's just loose and relaxed and you feel safe. Some people with PTSD don't feel safe very often though. So this can get tricky. Another thing that a person can do is the mindful sip of water. And I got this from a guy named Stephen Porges, who's the father of polyvagal theory. Just a side note, but I did a training a while back on this, and it's a pretty useful one. Basically, you use mindfulness, the mindful sip of water. Feel the temperature of the cup, you smell it, you notice the neutrality, touch the cup to your lip, you notice the temperature of the cup, the smoothness of the cup, take a little sip, move it around in your mouth, notice the neutrality, swallow it down and follow it as deep down into your belly as you can. What that does is it literally moves some of the brain back up here into your more calm zones, your more neutral zones. So what you're looking for when the parasympathetic nervous system is engaged, that means that the sympathetic nervous system is now disengaging. That's what we want. And what we're looking for really is neutral states in the brain. Where this gets screwed up for people a lot of the time is around the sympathetic nervous system and neutral states versus positives or pleasure seeking. So pleasure seeking will take you out of some of the anxious feelings you have, but you're still aroused. We could throw anything in there. Super sweet foods, sex, things like that really arouse the system and charge the system. Those are things that can also kind of pull you out of the anxiousness, but you've got to remember that your body is still charged. So then what'll happen with people, blood in the brain is elastic. So pleasure will really pull the blood further away from like your peak stress centers, but it'll also pop it back kind of like a rubber band, whoosh, back at you guys. And so that's not good either. Pleasure seeking in general, I mean, it's okay to do that once in a while, but when you're a person who's got PTSD, it gets a little complicated because you're still kind of in that hyper aroused state when you're pleasure seeking, just like you were when you were in fight or flight. It's just now you're in pleasure seeking instead, but the sympathetic nervous system is still engaged. So what you want to do is you want to find neutrality. You want to find neutral to slightly positive activities. So that could be, for me, that might be tying a fly or building bullets or creating something with my hands. I like to use my hands and make stuff like elk calls and stuff like that. So, neutral to slightly positive. So that's one thing that you really want to do. You'll also want to use grounding exercises. So like for me right now, I can feel my feet on the floor. I feel the weight of my butt and my back in my chair. I feel my fingertips pressed together, and I notice the temperature of the room. I smell the air. I hear the sounds of the traffic going by and a clock over here that's making a little tick. I ask myself, what's happening now? Nothing bad, just sitting in a room. It's warm, the clock's ticking, traffic's going by. It's pretty safe here. Neutral, right? Neutral's super important. So if you're up here a lot, if a person's up here a lot, when you add neutral, it brings us down a little. Well, then we start to climb back up. So what you want to do is you got to retrain your brain. Bring it back to neutral, back to neutral, back to neutral. The more you do that throughout the day, the more you start to retrain your brain to not be in a sympathetic nervous system engaged state. So in a nutshell, that is PTSD, and those are some ways that you can manage some of the symptoms. So just to kind of sum it all up, post-traumatic stress is an event that occurs where there's a perception that you could die or someone else could die, or you hear of something that's life or death like that, and that can do it too. Down the road, what you look at is problems with anger, problems with nightmares, problems with feeling numb, feeling depressed and hopeless, and don't really know why. You just know that 6 months ago you were in a wreck and you started feeling crappy, after the wreck. That's kind of a good indicator. 2 things you can do to deal with that would be get in with a counselor who specializes in trauma and EMDR therapy specifically, and use relaxation techniques such as the mindful sip of water or grounding technique to come to neutral, and do that throughout your day. Thank you guys for tuning in. Hope you have a good day.